Snow fell, thick and silent, over the small town of Maplewood, Ohio, swallowing the streets in a blanket of white. Each rooftop glistened like glass, each lamppost frozen into a sculpture of ice. To most, it was a night for warmth and sleep, but inside a dim house at the edge of town, the silence was pierced by a trembling whisper. A 10-year-old girl, her ribs still screaming from the cruel belt strikes of her stepfather, clutched an old phone with both hands, as though it were the last rope keeping her from drowning. Her name was Lily Thompson. Pale skin, tangled brown hair falling across bruised cheeks, blue-gray eyes that should have been bright with laughter now wide, filled only with fear. Every shallow breath burned her lungs. She leaned closer to the receiver, her voice breaking like thin ice on a winter pond. "Please, help me. He hurt me." For years, she had been convinced no one would ever believe her. Tonight, she risked it all anyway. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher's steady voice promised help was already on its way. Across town, a man stirred. Officer Daniel Hayes, Maplewood PD, age 36, 12 years of service, a broad frame built for endurance, a face weathered by grief. Since the night he lost his younger brother in a car crash, his once easy smile had been buried beneath shadows. But the loss had left something else too, an unshakable vow, a promise to protect the ones no one else would stand for. As Daniel reached for his coat and badge, movement came from the corner of the room, not from another officer, but from his partner, a loyal German shepherd named Rex, muscles coiled under thick black and tan fur, amber eyes locked onto Daniel's every gesture. The bond between them was more than routine. It was trust, forged in moments of danger, in nights where one had saved the other. The call was simple on paper, a child in distress. But Daniel felt it something deeper, darker, lurking beneath the words. He knew this wasn't going to be just another rescue, and neither did Rex. As the cruiser's engine roared to life in the frozen night, tires crunching against snow, no one inside that quiet little town could imagine what was about to unravel. Behind the polished smile of a respected man lay a secret so vile it would shatter Maplewood's sense of safety. Tonight, the truth would not just come knocking, it would kick down the door. What began as a frightened child's whisper would ignite a storm of revelation. And by the time it was over, Lily's plea for help would not only save her life, it would expose a darkness powerful enough to bring an entire house of lies crashing down. Rex was a German shepherd, 6 years old, with a black and tan coat that gleamed under the station lights. His ears stood alert, eyes sharp amber, and muscles taut, with both strength and discipline. At 80 pounds, he moved with the confidence of a seasoned K9. Yet, there was something, more than discipline, in Rex's gaze. There was warmth. He had been trained to track suspects, sniff out contraband, and protect his handler. But Daniel knew the dog also had an uncanny instinct for people's emotions. Children, especially, seemed to find solace in him. Perhaps it was the gentleness in the way he lowered his head for them, or the quiet loyalty that radiated from him. Tonight, Rex padded beside Daniel as if sensing the gravity of the call. Daniel slid behind the wheel of the cruiser, Rex settling into the back seat with his head lifted, ears twitching as if he could already hear the echo of a child's plea. The radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice, confirming the location. A modest house on Cedar Street. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he accelerated through the snowy roads, his headlights cutting twin beams across the white darkness. The house came into view, its windows dark, no sign of life, except for the faint light flickering in one corner. Daniel parked the cruiser quietly, the crunch of tires on snow, muffled by the storm. He glanced back at Rex, who had already risen, tail stiff, body alert. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, though his own heart hammered. As he approached the porch, the door creaked open just a fraction, and a small figure emerged. Lee, she stood, barefoot on the wooden floorboards, a thin nightgown clinging to her small frame. Her hair was uncombed, and her face bore the shadow of fresh bruises along her cheekbone. Her arms wrapped tightly around her ribs as if to hold herself together. The porch light illuminated her features just enough for Daniel to see the depth of fear in her eyes. "Lily," he asked softly, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. His voice was low, steady, careful not to startle her. "I'm Officer Hayes. You called us. You're safe now." Lily's lips trembled, and she shook her head quickly, glancing back into the house as though afraid. Someone might be listening. She did not speak, but her tiny hand lifted hesitantly, fingers trembling as she extended it forward. It wasn't toward Daniel, but toward Rex. The German shepherd stepped forward, moving with the measured calm of a creature who knew instinctively what was required. He lowered his head until his nose was level with her hand. Lily touched him timidly at first, then clutched his fur as though anchoring herself to something solid in a world that had crumbled. Her tears spilled silently, wetting the dog's coat. Rex stood still, his eyes flicking briefly to Daniel before returning to the girl, as if to say, "She needs me." Daniel felt his chest tighten at the sight. He knew that this bond, this silent trust, would be the key to uncovering the truth. "Lily," he said gently, keeping his eyes on her, but lowering his tone. "We're here to help you. No one will hurt you tonight, not while we're here." Her head moved slightly in a nod, but she didn't dare speak. Instead, she clutched Rex tighter, her small frame trembling. Behind her, the house loomed like a silent witness. Daniel scanned the darkened windows, listening for footsteps, for movement, any sign of the man Lily feared. But the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. He could feel the weight of secrets pressing from inside. "Let's get you somewhere warm," Daniel whispered. "Can you come with us?" Lily hesitated, biting her lip. Then she looked at Rex, and as though drawing strength from the dog's steady presence, she gave another small nod. Daniel wrapped his coat around her shoulders, careful not to touch the bruises along her arms. Together, they descended the steps, Rex walking on her other side like a guardian. Each crunch of snow beneath their feet was a step, away from the shadows that had consumed her childhood. By the time they reached the cruiser, Lily was shivering, violently, though Daniel couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the memory of pain. He opened the back door, allowing Rex to hop inside first. The dog settled quickly, leaving room for Lily to climb. In beside him, she pressed herself against his side the moment she sat down, and Rex rested his head gently across her lap, his steady breathing a rhythm to calm her ragged sobs. Daniel closed the door, pausing for a moment as his breath clouded in the icy air. He looked back at the house once more, its windows dark and unyielding, and he knew that what they had just witnessed was only the beginning. Behind those walls lay the truth, a truth that had left its mark on Lily's small body and terrified eyes, a truth that would have to be dragged into the light. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, Daniel spoke softly into the radio, his voice firm but steady. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. Child is located alive. Multiple visible injuries were bringing her in." The words felt heavy, but also resolute. The fight had begun. In the back seat, Lily's eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion pulling her under. But even in sleep, her hand remained tangled in Rex's fur, as though she knew the German shepherd would not let her go. And Daniel, glancing in the mirror at the fragile figure leaning against his K9 partner, silently vowed that neither would he. The fluorescent lights in the Maplewood police station hummed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the quiet hallway that led to the safe room. It was a small, softly furnished space meant for children and victims of trauma. Pale blue walls, a couch draped with a knitted blanket, and a low bookshelf with scattered picture books no one had touched in years. To most people, it looked simple, unremarkable. To 10-year-old Lily Thompson, it felt like a cage made of unfamiliar shadows. She sat curled into the farthest corner of the couch, her knees drawn up tightly against her chest. Her small hands clutched the fabric of the blanket, as if gripping onto an anchor in stormy waters. The nightgown she still wore hung loosely on her frame, the thin cotton barely hiding the bruises that marked her arms. Her brown hair was unkempt, strands sticking to her damp cheeks where tears had dried. The blue-gray eyes that peered out from beneath, lowered lashes darted nervously to the door every few seconds, as though she expected her stepfather to appear, even here, even now. Officer Daniel Hayes entered, quietly, careful not to let the door slam. His heavy boots, usually so loud on the station floors, seemed to soften with deliberate effort. At 36, Daniel's broad shoulders filled the frame, his navy uniform neat, but carrying the wrinkles of long hours. His face, with its neatly kept beard and the streaks of gray at his temples, was stern, but softened by something rare, patience. He had seen enough victims to know that rushing would only deepen the fractures already carved into their trust. Trailing just behind him was Rex, his K9 partner. The German shepherd padded into the room with the calm assurance of a creature who knew he was welcome. His tan and black coat gleamed even under the harsh lights, his body strong yet graceful. At 6 years old, Rex carried himself with the poise of a veteran. He sniffed the air once, ears twitching, then lowered himself slowly to the carpet, eyes fixed gently on the trembling girl on the couch. Lily's gaze flickered toward Daniel, then down to Rex. She didn't speak, but her hands fidgeted with the blanket, pulling at loose threads as if they might unravel. Her fear. Daniel crouched down, his large frame folding until his eyes were level with hers. His voice was low, careful, carrying none of the authority he used on the streets. "Lily, you're safe here," he said. "No one can hurt you tonight, not while we're here." She didn't answer. Her lips trembled, but no words came. Daniel didn't push. Instead, he tilted his head slightly toward Rex, who had inched closer. The dog settled down at the base of the couch, resting, his head on his paws. His amber eyes stayed fixed on Lily, calm and steady, radiating something no human could manufacture. Wordless reassurance. It was Rex, not Daniel, who finally broke the silence. Lily hesitated, then stretched out one small hand. When her fingers brushed the thick fur on his neck, her face crumpled. A sob escaped her, raw and childlike. And then she folded forward, burying her face into Rex's side. The dog didn't move, except to nuzzle her slightly closer, as if bracing her against the world. Daniel watched silently, a lump forming in his throat. He had seen Rex chase down fugitives, search collapsed barns for missing children, even face knives with unwavering loyalty. But this quiet ability to absorb a child's pain was the reason Daniel trusted Rex more than anyone. Minutes passed before Lily lifted her head again. Eyes swollen, but clearer. She whispered, voice so faint that Daniel had to lean forward to catch it. He used the belt. Always the belt. Daniel nodded slowly, careful not to let anger twist his face. "Your stepfather, Mark." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she gave the smallest nod. "He says I make him angry. He says no one would believe me, that I'm just a kid, that I lie." Her shoulders shook, but Rex pressed closer, his warm breath steady against her hands. She clutched his fur tightly, as if she feared letting go would bring the nightmare back. Daniel sat back on his heels, letting his gaze soften. "Lily," he said gently, "I believe you. Rex believes you too." The words made her blink, as if unsure whether she had heard correctly. For the first time since arriving, her eyes met Daniel's fully. In them, he saw a fragile flame hope flickering against the winds of fear. The door opened softly, and Detective Sarah Miller stepped inside. Sarah was in her early 42nd, tall and slender, with a no-nonsense air that had earned her respect in the department. Her dark auburn hair was tied back neatly, and the faint lines around her hazel eyes hinted at years spent listening to stories of hurt and injustice. Unlike Daniel's stern presence, Sarah's warmth came through in the tilt of her smile, the softness in her tone. "Hi, Lily," she said gently, staying by the door so as not to overwhelm the child. "My name's Sarah. I work with Daniel. I'm here to listen, that's all." Lily's eyes flickered nervously toward the new woman, but Rex shifted slightly as if signaling it was safe. Encouraged, Lily whispered again, voice steadier this time. "He hit me because I spilled milk. Because I asked for new shoes. Sometimes just because." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "He says I should be quiet, that no one wants to hear me." Sarah's face hardened for just a second, then softened again. She moved to sit in the chair opposite Lily, leaning forward, slightly. "You deserve to be heard, Lily, and you are being heard right now. What he did to you is wrong. You did nothing to deserve it." Lily's breath hitched, tears welling again. She looked down at Rex, who gave a small chuff of breath, as though agreeing. For the first time, a ghost of a smile tugged at her lips. Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah. They both knew the significance of this moment. Children like Lily rarely spoke out. Years of manipulation, of being told. Their voices didn't matter, often left them mute in the face of justice. But tonight, against all odds, Lily had begun to break the silence. "She trusted the dog first," Sarah murmured softly as they stepped outside the room later. Daniel nodded, his eyes following the sight of Lily, stroking Rex's fur, through the half-open door. "Sometimes," he said, "dogs know how to pick up the pieces we can't." Back inside, Lily sat straighter, still clutching the blanket but speaking now, in halting sentences. She recounted the nights when Mark's footsteps creaked down the hallway, the hiss of the belt, leaving its place in the closet, the sting and the suffocating words that followed. She described hiding bruises under long sleeves, forcing smiles at school, and the terror of knowing her voice would be dismissed. Every detail. landed heavily in the room, but Daniel and Sarah never interrupted. Rex never moved, and in that cocoon of listening, Lily's trembling slowly eased. For the first time in years, someone believed of her. For the first time, she felt the truth wasn't a burden she carried alone. By the time midnight passed, Lily was exhausted, her small body sagging against the couch. Daniel placed a fresh blanket over her shoulders, and Rex shifted closer, curling himself like a shield at her side. The child's hand remained tangled in the shepherd's fur, even as sleep finally claimed her. Daniel stood by the door, watching the scene with a quiet ache in his chest. Sarah touched his arm, her voice low. "This is just the beginning, Daniel. But she's stronger than she looks." He nodded. She just needed someone to believe her. And as the snowstorm continued outside, the fragile bond between a broken child, a weary cop, and a loyal dog began to form. A bond strong, enough to pierce the silence that had trapped her for so long. The following afternoon, the storm had passed, but the streets of Maplewood still bore its scars. Snow shoveled into uneven mounds along the sidewalks. Branches bowed under the weight of ice, and a sharp chill that clung to the air like an unwelcome guest. Officer Daniel Hayes steered his cruiser slowly down Cedar Street, eyes fixed on the modest house where Lily's nightmare had played out. The neighborhood looked deceptively peaceful. White picket fences enclosed small yards, icicles hung glittering from gutters, and the faint sound of children playing echoed from 2 blocks away. Yet Daniel felt the dissonance immediately. He knew what Lily had whispered through tears. He knew the bruises on her arms weren't the result of clumsiness. And he knew deep in his bones that beneath the painted smiles and Sunday greetings, this street was hiding something darker. Beside him, Rex shifted in the passenger seat, ears prick-ricked, gaze sharp. The German shepherd had sensed tension since they turned onto the block, his body stiffening as if preparing for a fight that had not yet begun. Daniel reached out, brushing the dog's sturdy shoulder. "We'll find it, boy," he murmured. "Whatever's hidden here." The first stop was a conversation with the neighbors. Across the street lived Mrs. Eleanor Carter, a retired schoolteacher in her late 62nd. Eleanor was petite with silver hair tied neatly in a bun and wore a thick knitted cardigan of faded green. Her pale face held deep lines carved by years of discipline and compassion, and though her voice was soft, it carried the firm clarity of someone used to commanding a classroom. "Oh, Officer Hayes," she said, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. "You're asking about Mark Parker, aren't you?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Anything you can. Tell me?" Eleanor sighed, her brows knitting. "Everyone around here thinks he's just wonderful, always mowing the lawn, greeting us at church, lending a hand if someone needs their driveway cleared. I can't say I've ever seen him lose his temper. Polite, respectful." She hesitated then, her lips pressing. Then, "Though I'll admit, the little girl never seemed happy. Sweet Lily, always, with her head down, hardly ever smiled. I thought perhaps she was just shy." Daniel thanked her, noting the faint tremor in her tone. The kindness in Eleanor's face made it hard for her to accept that a man she greeted weakly might be a monster. That was how men like Mark thrived, masking their cruelty with ordinary charm. On the next block, Daniel spoke with Mr. Howard Green, a mail carrier in his early 52nd, who had delivered to the street for nearly 2 decades. Howard was tall and lean, with his weathered hands and a grizzled beard that framed his face like frostbitten ivy. His eyes, though kind, held a weariness that spoke of long winters and a life spent outdoors. Parker Howard scratched his chin, always said hello when I dropped the mail, paid his bills on time, never caused trouble. He frowned. But the girl Lily, I did notice she wore long sleeves even in July. Saw her once tripped carrying the trash can, and when I went to help, Parker came out fast, real fast, put his hand on her shoulder, almost shoved her back inside before I could say anything, said she was clumsy, something about the way he smiled at me. Then it didn't sit right. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. That small detail, a moment easily forgotten by most, painted a clearer picture. The facade was cracking. Finally, Daniel returned to the house itself. The front yard was eerily still, snow packed down by boot prints that led to the door. The curtains were drawn tight across the windows, blocking out the daylight. Rex trotted at his side, nose twitching, body vibrating with alertness. The back of the house told a different story. The Ground sloped slightly toward a shed-like structure attached to the foundation. Its wooden door was weathered, painting, a rusted padlock dangling brokenly at the latch. And there, before the door, Rex stopped. The German shepherd lowered his head, sniffing intently. Then, with a sudden growl that rumbled deep in his chest, he clawed at the concrete near the threshold. His hackles rose, ears pinned forward. Every muscle in his frame screamed, "Warning!" Daniel crouched beside him, peering at the lock. It had been forced open before, perhaps hastily closed to keep appearances. A damp chill seeped from the crack at the base of the door, carrying with it the sour tang of mildew and something else. Something metallic, faint, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of Daniel's neck. Lily stood a few steps behind, wrapped in a borrowed coat from the station. Her small frame quivered, not entirely from the cold. Her blue-gray eyes were fixed on the door, wide with memory. "That's where he keeps things," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The belt? The box?" He said no one should ever open it. Her hands twisted the fabric of her sleeves, as if bracing for punishment. Even now. Daniel turned to her, his expression steady but gentle. "You don't have to go in, Lily. Not yet. You've done enough." But the girl shook her head quickly, determination flickering through her fear. "I need you to know I'm not lying." Daniel's chest tightened. The fact that she still felt the need to prove herself broke something inside him. He rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "I believe you," he said firmly. "But we'll do this the right way. We'll get a warrant, and then we'll open it." The rest of the afternoon blurred into procedure. Daniel contacted Judge Robert Matthews, a stocky man in his late 52nd, with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for fairness. Matthews, though stern in demeanor, was known for his deep care for children. He'd once volunteered at the county youth shelter before being appointed to the bench. Listening to Daniel's report, his blue eyes hardened with resolve. Within hours, a warrant was issued to search the Parker residence. When Daniel returned to the yard with the official papers in hand, Rex stood tall, tail rigid, eyes locked on the cellar door. Lily, watching from the cruiser, pressed her hand against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Daniel approached. Slowly, the crunch of his boots on the snow unnervingly loud in the silence. He bent down, studied the lock one last time, and felt the heavy weight of what might be waiting behind it. Secrets hidden for years, pain sealed in, darkness. As the evening sun dipped low, turning the snow to a dull gold, Daniel glanced at Rex. The dog's body was taut, ready, his growl a low hum of certainty. And in that moment, Daniel knew his instincts, and Lily's terrified whisper were right. Behind that door lay the shadows that would either break their case wide open or reveal horrors, even darker than they imagined. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to hang low over Maplewood, pressing down on the rooftops with a quiet weight. For Officer Daniel Hayes, the day carried a sense of inevitability. The warrant had been signed, and there would be no more waiting. Today, the Parker house would yield its secrets. Daniel pulled his cruiser into the driveway just as two other officers arrived to assist. One of them, Officer Brian Keller, was a man in his late 22nd, stocky and broad-shouldered with sandy blonde hair cropped close to his scalp. His square jaw and clean-shaven face gave him a boyish appearance, but his pale blue eyes revealed the seriousness of someone who had seen enough in 4 years on the force to lose his innocence. Known for his blunt honesty, Keller was loyal to the bone, though sometimes too quick to anger when confronted with injustice. The second officer, Detective Maria Lopez, stepped out of an unmarked sedan. She was in her mid-32nd of Mexican-American descent with dark brown eyes sharp enough to cut through lies. Her long black hair was tied into a no-nonsense braid that fell over her shoulder, and her tall, lean frame moved with the fluidity of someone used to commanding attention in a room. Colleagues respected her for her tenacity. She was the kind of detective who would follow a thread of evidence until it unraveled completely. Years earlier, she had worked a case involving child neglect that ended tragically. Since then, she had carried a quiet determination to never let another child slip through the cracks. Daniel nodded. Into them both. "Let's get this done right," he said. His voice was steady, but his clenched jaw betrayed the storm building inside. Rex leapt gracefully from the cruiser, landing with a soft thud on the snow-packed ground. His coat shimmered in the cold light, every muscle taut, ears perked forward. He trotted immediately toward the backyard, nose already working the air, as if he could sense what lay ahead. The back door to the cellar creaked as the padlock was cut. A musty draft escaped, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of mildew and neglect. Daniel felt the chill wrap around his spine as he pulled the door open wider. The darkness within seemed to breathe. Keller flicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. Concrete steps led downward, damp and uneven. The walls lined with shelves of forgotten paint cans and rusting tools. Water dripped steadily from a pipe overhead, echoing in the confined space. Rex descended first, his claws clicking against the concrete. His body stiffened as he sniffed along the edges of the room. He paused, ears flat, then padded deliberately toward the far corner, where a stack of cardboard boxes leaned precariously. His low growl reverberated off the stone walls. Daniel followed, crouching beside the dog. He shifted aside the boxes, revealing a small wooden chest, weathered and stained, its edges chewed by time. A heavy padlock hung from its latch, but Keller quickly snapped it open with a bolt cutter. The lid groaned as Daniel lifted it, the hinges reluctant to give way. Inside lay the evidence that Lily's nightmares had promised. The first item was a leather belt. Its surface cracked and darkened, but along the edges, near the buckle, were faint stains, a maroon, brown discoloration. Daniel didn't need a lab to identify. Old blood, he felt. His stomach tightened, his grip white-knuckled around the object. Next, he drew out a notebook, its cover battered, the pages yellowed and curled at the edges. As he flipped through, the handwriting within jumped out harsh angular script, filled with venom, phrases scrolled in thick ink. She must learn silence. No, one will believe her. Disobedience demands punishment. Each line was a chilling echo of the words Lily had whispered through tears. Finally, buried beneath a pile of broken toys and scraps of fabric, Keller's flashlight caught the glint of plastic, a small memory card taped to the bottom of a cracked doll's torso. Daniel carefully peeled it free, holding it up. It was tiny but heavy with implication. Detective Lopez's voice was low, hard. That could be everything. Daniel exhaled slowly. He imagined what might be on it. Perhaps recordings, photographs, evidence Mark had kept in his arrogance or cruelty. He knew in that moment that this wasn't just about proving abuse. This was about dismantling the illusion Mark had so carefully cultivated. Upstairs, Lily had been waiting in the cruiser under the care of a female officer. When Daniel returned with the box, she spotted the belt instantly. Her breath hitched, and she recoiled, pressing herself against the seat. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That's it. That's the one." Her small hands clutched the edge of her coat as she stared at the evidence, her body trembling. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't just from fear. They were from the relief of finally being believed. Daniel crouched by the car door, keeping his voice calm. "You don't need to look at it anymore, Lily. We have what we need now. You've been so brave." She shook her head, wiping her eyes. "He used that to make me." "Stay quiet," he said. If I ever told, he'd use it again." Her words dissolved into sobs, and Rex, who had padded to her side, nudged his head beneath her hand. Instinctively, Lily gripped his fur, clinging to the one constant source of safety she had known since this nightmare began. Detective Lopez, watching from the steps, crossed her arms tightly, her jaw clenched. Keller muttered a curse under his breath, unable to mask his anger. The image of the bruised girl and the cruel evidence before them stripped away the last traces of doubt. Daniel closed the box with finality. "This isn't just a cellar," he said, voice low but firm. "It's a crime scene, and it's going to put him away." Later that evening, back at the station, the items were logged meticulously. Forensic teams collected samples from the belt, fingerprints from the chest, and examined the notebook. The memory card was handed to the digital forensics unit, where a quiet young technician named Ethan Moore, a wiry man, in his late 22nd with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers from his habit of doodling during long data scans, carefully began extracting files. Ethan was known for his almost obsessive precision. He rarely spoke much, preferring the company of computers to people, but his work had cracked open more than one case. As the files loaded onto the screen, Daniel stood behind him, heart pounding. The first video appeared, a grainy clip of the Parker living room. A child's cry echoed, followed by the unmistakable crack of leather on skin. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, fury tightening his chest. The proof was undeniable. When the night finally fell quiet, Daniel found Lily asleep in the safe room once again, curled beneath a blanket with Rex at her side. The dog's steady breathing filled the silence, his amber eyes flicking up briefly as Daniel entered, as if to say, "She's safe, I've got her." Daniel leaned against the doorway, exhaustion tugging at him, but a grim sense of victory steadied his resolve. The shadows of Mark Parker's secrets had been pulled into the light. What had once been whispers of a child were now evidence in black and white. And though the battle was far from over, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. Mark Parker would never again wield that belt in silence. The safe room in the Maplewood police station was quiet except for the hum of the heater, struggling against the late winter chill. The walls, painted a soft sky blue, were meant to soothe, though the stillness of the air felt heavy with expectation. A box of tissues sat neatly on the low table, untouched. Across from it, 10-year-old Lily Thompson sat with her knees drawn together, her hands twisting in her lap as if she were trying to hold her courage in place. Her blue gay eyes were downcast, avoiding every adult gaze in the room. A borrowed sweater, too large for her frame, hung awkwardly on her thin shoulders, sleeves swallowing her wrists. Stray strands of brown hair fell across her face, veiling the bruises still faintly visible on her cheekbone. She seemed even smaller, beneath the fluorescent light, as though trying to disappear into the chair. Officer Daniel Hayes sat across from her, his broad frame leaning forward, forearms resting on the table. He had traded his uniform jacket for a simple shirt to look less intimidating, though the weight of his presence still filled the room. His dark eyes, framed by a neatly kept beard, and the faint creases of a man used to listening more than speaking, stayed locked gently on Lily. Beside Lily, on the floor, Rex had made himself comfortable. The 6-year-old German shepherd lay with his body curved protectively against her chair, his head resting on her lap. Each time, her small fingers twitched nervously. They found his thick black and tan fur, stroking as if to ground herself in his warmth. His amber eyes stayed half-closed, calm and steady, but his ears flicked toward every sound, alert and ready. At the far side of the room sat Detective Sarah Miller, tall and slender, with auburn hair pulled into a tidy bun, her hazel eyes softened for the child before her. She was dressed in plain gray slacks and a navy sweater, her usual sharp edges rounded by the tenderness she reserved for children. In her years on the job, Sarah had witnessed many victims struggle to speak. Her quiet patience was her strength, and she radiated an aura of safety that often coaxed words where fear had silenced them. Also present was Detective Maria Lopez, leaning against the wall, her posture erect, but her dark brown eyes carrying a fierce compassion. Her black braid rested over one shoulder, her jaw clenched not in impatience but in a silent promise of justice. Near her stood Officer Brian Keller, broad and square-jawed, his arms crossed, his pale, blue eyes shadowed by restrained anger. Keller, with his sandy blonde hair and restless stance, looked every bit the man who despised seeing harm done to those who couldn't fight back. The room waited. Daniel spoke first, his voice low and steady. "Lily, we're here to listen, that's all. Nothing you say will get you in trouble. You don't have to be afraid anymore." For a long moment, Lily didn't move. Her small fingers twisted harder into Rex's fur, her lips pressed shut, then her shoulders began to tremble. A soft sob escaped, and suddenly the dam broke. She leaned forward, her face burying into Rex's neck, her words tumbling out between gasps of breath. "He hit me with the belt, always the belt. When I spilled milk, when I asked for new shoes, when I didn't finish homework, he said, I made him angry." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to go on. "He broke my ribs once. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but he told me if I did, no one would ever believe me. He said I was just a liar, a stupid little girl who made up stories." Sarah's hazel eyes glistened, though she kept her composure. She leaned forward slightly. "And what did you do when he said those things?" Lily sniffled, wiping her sleeve, hands across her nose. "I stayed quiet. I wore long sleeves to school. Even when it was hot, I didn't want anyone to see." Her words sliced through the room, sharper than any blade. Keller shifted in his chair, jaw clenched so tight, the muscles in his cheek twitched. Lopez's arms folded tighter across her chest, her nails biting into her skin. Daniel felt every word land like a stone in his chest. Lily's tears came faster now, her small body shaking. "I hated the sound of his footsteps. At night, I would sit on my bed and cover my ears, but I could still hear them heavy, slow, and I knew he was coming. Her voice faltered. But Rex nudged his nose against her hand, pressing closer. She gripped his fur, steadying herself. Sometimes I wished I could just disappear. But then I thought maybe someone would come, maybe. Someone would hear me. She looked up suddenly, eyes glassy with desperation. And you did. The words struck Daniel harder than any blow. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat. You did the bravest thing you could, Lily. You called. You asked for help. That's how we're here now. Sarah reached in the tissue box and slid it across the table. Lily took one with trembling fingers, dabbing at her eyes. Every time. I thought about telling someone, she whispered. I remembered his voice. No one will believe you. He said it over and over, and I believed him. Lopez spoke then, her voice low but steady, carrying the weight of truth. But he was wrong, Lily. We believe you, and the evidence we found believes you, too. He can't hide behind his lies anymore. Lily's gaze darted toward her, surprise, flickering across her face. The idea that adults were standing on her side, rather than against her, seemed almost too much to grasp. She looked back down at Rex, who blinked slowly, breathing steady and calm, as if anchoring her in the storm. The interview stretched on, not rushed, but careful, piece by piece. Lily spoke of the nights she lay awake, listening to her mother's silence in the next room, of how she prayed each day, to pass without punishment, of how she covered the bruises and made excuses. She described hiding in corners, clutching an old toy rabbit until it seemed split, each memory spilled with tears, each detail carving deeper into the air of the room. And yet, with every word, something changed. The fear that had once sealed her lips loosened. The truth, jagged and painful, was no longer hers to bear alone. When at last her voice gave out, Daniel closed his notebook gently, unwilling to push her further. He leaned forward, speaking softly. Lily, you've done something incredible today. You've given us your truth, and with your words and the evidence we found, we can make sure he never hurts you again. Her small shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but for the first time, a flicker of relief crossed her face. She wiped her cheeks again, her voice. Do you promise? Daniel's dark eyes met hers, unwavering. I promise you're not alone anymore. Rex, as if sealing the vow, lifted his head and pressed his nose against her arm. Lily let out a soft sob, this time. Not of fear, but of release, and leaned into the shepherd's warmth. Around the room, silence hung heavy. Keller blinked, hard, looking away as if to disguise the moisture in his eyes. Sarah exhaled slowly, the tension easing from her frame. Lopez straightened, her jaw still set, but her gaze softer now, full of resolve. In that room, the weight of Lily's testimony transformed from burden to weapon. A voice that had once been silenced now echoed louder than Mark Parker's threats could ever hope to. The courthouse of Franklin County was a building meant to inspire reverence. Its tall stone columns loomed against the gray morning sky, and the carved wooden doors were dark, with polish and history. On this day, however, the courthouse was more than a place of law. It was a stage, where a hidden life of abuse would be dragged into the light. Inside, every seat of the gallery was filled. Neighbors from Maplewood whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances. Many of them had waved to Mark Parker for years, had shaken his hand after Sunday's services, had accepted his broad smile as truth. Witness whether those smiles had been a mask. At the plaintiff's table sat Lily Thompson, dwarfed by the weight of the room. She wore a pale blue dress that Sarah had chosen for her, simple, modest, and meant to let her feel like a child again, rather than a victim. Even so, the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed restless nights. Her small hands clung to the thick fur of Rex, who lay at her feet, body curved protectively around her chair. The German shepherd's amber eyes were calm but alert, scanning the crowd, never far from the girl he guarded. Beside Lily sat Officer Daniel Hayes, his broad frame composed, but his jaw set tight. In his dark suit, he looked more like a watchful guardian than a witness. Every so often, he reached down to brush his coarse fingers over Rex's head, grounding both himself and Lily. At the defense table, Mark Parker sat stiffly, dressed in a dark gray suit that was tailored to perfectly. The knot of his tie centered with surgical precision. His dark hair was combed back neatly, and his clean-shaven jaw gave him the air of respectability. But his pale blue eyes, once confident and charming, darted uneasily around the room. His attorney, Richard Calloway, leaned close, whispering encouragement. Calloway was a man in his early 52nd, tall and angular, with thinning blonde hair slicked back from a high forehead. His sharp nose and narrow jaw gave his face the permanent look of someone calculating odds. He was known across the county as a defense lawyer who thrived on technicalities, a man who could spin doubt from the thinnest threads. His dark suit was immaculate, his gold cufflinks gleaming. But beneath the polish, there was an unmistakable coldness. At the front of it, the court, presiding over the case, was Judge Eleanor Whitman. In her late 52nd, Whitman was a woman of presence, her silver-gray hair cut short in a sharp bob, her steel-rimmed glasses resting low on her nose. Her face was lined, but not worn. The line spoke of discipline and long years of bearing authority. Known for her firm but fair hand, she had once served as a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children. Her reputation for compassion blended with severity made her both respected and feared. The jury, 12 men and women from across Franklin County, sat in silence, their faces a mixture of curiosity, dread, and resolve. Calloway rose first, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing slowly before them. "What we have here is not a case of cruelty, but of misunderstanding. My client, Mr. Parker, is a strict father. Yes, but strictness is not abuse. Children fall, children browse, accidents happen. Discipline, though unpopular in today's world, has long been a cornerstone of raising responsible young people. Do not let a child's exaggerations cloud the truth." His words slithered through the air, appealing to doubts, to the instinct to dismiss a child's pain as dramatics. Mark Parker sat a little taller as Calloway spoke, as if feeding on the defense. But when prosecutor Linda Grant rose, the air shifted. Linda was a woman, in her early 42nd, of medium build, with warm brown skin and tight black curls, propped close to her head. Her dark eyes burned with quiet intensity, and her calm, measured voice carried a power that silenced murmurs in the gallery. She had built her career on cases of domestic violence and carried herself with the conviction of someone who believed that truth once uncovered could not be buried again. "Discipline," she said, her voice even, "does not break ribs. Discipline does not leave a child gasping for air in the dark of night. And discipline does not silence a girl with threats that her voice is worthless. Today you will see not stories, but evidence. Evidence that speaks louder than any polished excuse." Her words lingered heavy with promise. The first witness was Daniel. He spoke calmly, carefully describing the night of the call. The trembling voice on the other end of the line, the sight of Lily standing in the doorway, bruised and terrified. His testimony painted the image of a child desperate for help. Keller and Lopez followed, recounting the search of the Parker residence, their voices tinged with restrained fury as they described the hidden cellar, the belt stained with blood, the notebook filled with threats, and the memory card taped to the broken toy. But it was the video that silenced the courtroom. The lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life. The grainy footage showed the living room dimly lit, the camera's angle fixed. Then the sound came, sharp, vicious cracks of leather against skin. Lily's cries filled the room, high-pitched, desperate, echoing across the polished wood of the courtroom. The jury flinched. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. On the screen, Mark Parker's voice thundered, "No one will believe you. You are nothing." In the gallery, whispers erupted and then fell into suffocating silence. At the defense table, Mark shifted, his jaw tightening, sweat beading at his temples. He tried to sit still, but his composure wavered, his carefully built mask cracking with each second of footage. Judge Whitman's face hardened, her glasses sliding down slightly as she peered over them, eyes sharp as blades. At the plaintiff's table, Lily buried her face into Rex's fur, her small hands gripping Shepard's coat so tightly her knuckles widened. The dog stayed immovable, his head pressed lightly against her shoulder, absorbing her trembling. Daniel placed a steadying hand on Lily's back, whispering softly, "You're safe. He can't touch you again." When the video ended, the silence in the courtroom was heavy, oppressive. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, Judge Whitman cleared her throat, her voice low but firm. "Let the record reflect that the evidence presented is both graphic and disturbing. The jury will consider it carefully." Mark Parker's mask crumbled further. He muttered angrily to Calloway, who hissed back under his breath, trying to quiet him, but the damage was done. His image as a kind, respectable man had been shattered, his violence displayed for all to see. Prosecutor Grant rose once more. She gestured toward Lily, who still clung to Rex. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, no child should ever have to beg to be believed. You have heard her cries. You have seen the truth with your own eyes. Mark Parker is not a strict father. He is an abuser who used fear as his weapon. Today, that weapon has been taken from him." Her words echoed in the silence, leaving the courtroom breathless. The verdict came. On a Friday afternoon, when the winter sun hung low and pale above Franklin County, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Inside, the jury filed in, their faces solemn. For hours they had deliberated, weighing every word, every scream from the video, every piece of evidence that cut through the lies Mark Parker had spun for years. When the foreman, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a farmer's hands, rose to deliver the decision, the room held its breath. "On the charge of aggravated assault and child endangerment," he said, voice steady, "we find the defendant, Mark Parker, guilty." The words rang out like a bell, tolling the end of an era. Murmurs rippled through the packed courtroom, spreading from the bell, the jury box, to the gallery, where townsfolk from Maplewood sat wide-eyed in disbelief. Judge Eleanor Whitman leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Parker. Her lined face betrayed no satisfaction, only gravity. "Mark Parker, this court sentences you to 25 years in state prison," she declared, her voice firm as stone. "May this serve as a reminder that cruelty hidden behind closed doors is still cruelty, and justice will not look away." Parker's carefully cultivated mask shattered completely. His pale blue eyes widened, his hands gripped the table so tightly. His knuckles turned white. He began to mutter under his breath, then raised his voice, sputtering denials, until the bailiff, a broad-shouldered officer named Tom Grady, with grizzled gray hair and a voice deep as gravel, placed a steadying hand on his arm. Grady had seen many men like Parker before, and his lined face bore the weary patience of someone who knew justice took time, but always came. As Parker was led away in cuffs, his once commanding frame seemed to shrink. He looked not like the respectable neighbor or the stern father figure, but like a man stripped bare, revealed as nothing more than a coward who had preyed on the weak. The town of Maplewood reeled. Conversations buzzed in grocery aisles, whispers spread in pews at church, and heads shook in disbelief outside the diner on Main Street. Mrs. Eleanor Carter, the retired schoolteacher who had once praised Parker's politeness, was seen standing on her porch with tears in her eyes, clutching her shawl tighter as she admitted to neighbors that she had never looked closely enough at Lily. Mr. Howard Green, the mail carrier, walked, his route slower that week, guilt etched into his weathered face, as he recalled the day Parker had pulled Lily inside, too quickly. Yet, amid the shame and shock, there was also a quiet sense of resolve. The mask had fallen. The truth had prevailed. For Lily, however, the trial's end was not justice. It was the beginning of healing. She was placed under the temporary guardianship of Margaret Collins, a kind-hearted foster, a mother, in her early 62nd. Margaret was a woman of sturdy build with soft gray and hair cut short and laugh lines that deepened when she smiled. She had raised 3 children of her own and had fostered dozens more. Her home sat on the edge of town, a white clapboard house with a wraparound porch and wind chimes that sang softly in the breeze. Margaret greeted Lily with open arms and a warm, steady voice. "You are safe here, sweetheart," she said, her hands gentle as she led the girl inside. Her hazel eyes radiated a maternal kindness that needed no explanation. Rex padded in behind them, his paws clicking against the hardwood floor. The German Shepherd had been given special permission to remain by Lily's side, recognized not only as a service dog, but as her guardian in spirit. Margaret, herself an animal lover, welcomed him, without hesitation. "Any dog that loyal," she said with a smile, "belongs exactly where his child is." That first night in Margaret's home, Lily struggled to sleep. The quiet felt unfamiliar, almost too large, and she lay awake listening to the creak of the house settling. But Rex was there, curled beside her bed, his steady breathing a comfort. When nightmares came, she reached down and touched his fur, anchoring herself to the present until the shadows receded. By morning, a change had already begun. The sun rose over Maplewood, spilling golden light across the porch of Margaret's house. The frost that clung to the grass glittered like tiny diamonds, and the air carried the crisp promise of spring. Lily stepped out onto the porch wrapped in a knitted blanket, her thin frame still fragile, but standing taller than she had in weeks. Her blue-gray eyes, once dulled by fear, reflected the soft hues of dawn. She sat on the wooden steps, drawing in the cold morning air as if it were her first breath of freedom. Rex followed, trotting heavily before settling beside her. He lowered his head into her lap, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You believed in me when no one else did." The shepherd's only response was a soft sigh, his tail thumping once against the porch. But it was enough. Daniel visited later that morning, his tall frame filling the doorway as he carried a bag of groceries Margaret had asked for. His beard was neatly trimmed, his dark eyes tired, but lighter now, relieved. When Lily saw him, she ran forward without hesitation, clutching Rex at her side. "Is it really over?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Daniel crouched down, meeting of her gaze. "It's over, Lily. He can't hurt you again. Not ever." For the first time in years, the little girl allowed herself a smile. Fragile, hesitant, yet real. From the kitchen doorway, Margaret stood silently, her hazel eyes shimmering with both sorrow and pride. "This house," she whispered, "isn't just wood and walls. It's a beginning." That evening, as the horizon bled violet and the sun slid beneath the line of trees, Lily sat on the porch steps. Rex, her guardian, pressed close against her side, while Daniel rested just behind, his steady presence like a shield against the past. The crisp air carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys across Maplewood, the calls of birds softening into the night. Lily lowered her head against Rex's thick fur, her lips moving in words too small for the world, but enough for the stars. No more belts, no more shadows in the hallway, just peace. Rex shifted, leaning closer, as though promising her that he would stand between her and darkness for as long as he breathed. And then, just as the first stars pierced the violet sky, a sound broke the calm, a car engine, idling at the far edge of the street. Daniel's eyes lifted, sharp and unyielding. The silhouette inside the car did not move, only lingered, watching, waiting. The quiet porch, the fragile peace, suddenly held its breath. For Lily, the weight of fear rose for a moment like an old ghost, yet this time, she was not alone. This time, she had Rex at her side, Daniel's steady gaze in front of her, and Margaret's unwavering love within reach. The world might still whisper, still question how Maplewood had been deceived for so long. But here, beneath the bruised sky and in the glow of trust, Lily discovered something far stronger than fear: hope. Her story does not end with scars. It continues with courage, with the power of being believed, with the unshakable truth that one child's whisper can move mountains when someone chooses to listen. So, look closer. Listen deeper. The next Lily might be waiting in silence, hiding behind a smile you pass by every day. And remember, even in the darkest night, the dawn always comes. Sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with the growl of a dog who refuses to back away, and sometimes with the sound of footsteps drawing near, reminding us the fight for justice is never truly over.